Warning: this video contains sensitive topics and is intended for educational purposes only. Viewer discretion is advised. 4 college students are stabbed to death inside their own rental home in the middle of the night. 2 roommates survive upstairs having heard something but not understanding what, until police are already at the door. For 6 weeks, the killer is a complete unknown to a terrified college town. No name, no face, no clear motive. Then, investigators trace it all back to a single object left behind at the scene: a knife sheath. Touch DNA on its snap button eventually leads police not to a stranger passing through Moscow, Idaho, but to a criminology PhD student studying at a university just 10 miles away, someone who had literally been trained to understand how killers get caught. This is the case of Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogen, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin. 4 lives ended in a matter of minutes on November 13, 2022, in a case that would take years to fully resolve and end, without the one answer everyone still wants most. This video covers a real quadruple homicide, including graphic violence. Viewer discretion is advised. What makes this case so unusual is not just the scale of the violence in a town that had never seen anything like it. It is the fact that the person eventually arrested had spent his academic career studying exactly the kind of crime he was now accused of committing, and still left behind the one piece of evidence that would undo him. Kaylee Goncalves and Madison Mogen, known to everyone as Maddie, are 21 years old and best friends since childhood, growing up together in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, before enrolling together at the University of Idaho in Moscow. The two are inseparable through college, rooming together in a rental house on King Road, just off campus. Xana Kernodle is 20 years old, also living in that same King Road house. She is dating 20-year-old Ethan Chapin, a fellow student who does not officially live at the house, but who is there constantly enough that he is effectively part of the household. Ethan has a twin sister, also enrolled at the university, and the two of them, along with their close circle of friends, are a fixture of campus social life. 2 additional roommates share the house as well, both of whom would survive the night that is about to unfold, and both of whom become central witnesses in the case that follows. On the evening of November 12th, several of the housemates go out separately, some to a campus bar, some to a food truck, before returning to the King Road house in the early hours of November 13th to sleep. The King Road house itself is a gray 3-story rental on a quiet dead-end street near campus, the kind of property countless college towns have dozens of unremarkable in every way except for what would happen inside it that November. It becomes, almost overnight, one of the most photographed and discussed private residences in the country as national news crews descend on Moscow in the days following the murders. None of what happens next has anything to do with who these 4 young people were as individuals. Kaylee is remembered by her family as fiercely loyal and family-oriented. Maddie's stepfather would later describe her simply as someone who always brought joy into a room and who prioritized her family above almost everything else. Xana and Ethan are remembered together as a couple still early in their relationship building. The kind of ordinary college life, classes, friends, late nights, that thousands of students their age are living out at the exact same moment all across the country. 10 miles away across the state line in Pullman, Washington, a 28-year-old man named Bryan Kohberger is finishing up his first semester as a PhD student in criminology at Washington State University. Nothing in his academic record connects him publicly to any of these 4 students. He is, as far as anyone would later be able to determine, a complete stranger to all 4 of them. Moscow, Idaho itself is the kind of small university town where a rental house full of college students living together is about as ordinary a living situation as exists. Thousands of nearly identical households exist on nearly identical streets in college towns across the country every single year. Nothing about the King Road house itself, the students living there, or their daily routines set them apart from any other group of friends finishing out a normal semester. That very ordinariness is part of what makes the case so difficult for the wider public to process once the details become known. According to cell phone records later cited in the probable cause affidavit, Kohberger's phone had been in the vicinity of the King Road house at least 12 separate times in the months leading up to the murders, starting as early as August 20, 22 months before the killings themselves. Investigators would come to interpret this pattern as evidence of surveillance behavior rather than coincidence, though a clear reason for why this specific house was chosen has never been publicly established. In the days before November 13th, Kohberger's white 2015 Hyundai Elantra is captured on nearby surveillance cameras repeatedly circling the King Road neighborhood. Investigators later document these passes as part of a pattern consistent with someone studying the property's layout and routines rather than passing through by chance. On the night of November 12th, the 4 future victims and their surviving roommates go about an entirely ordinary Saturday. Some of the housemates go out to a bar downtown. Others get food from a local food truck. By the early hours of November 13th, everyone has returned to the King Road house and gone to sleep. Kaylee and Maddie on the 3rd floor, Xana and Ethan on the 2nd floor, along with the 2 roommates who would survive the night. Surveillance footage from the King Road neighborhood shows Kohberger's Hyundai Elantra beginning to circle the area again, starting around 3:30 a.m. on November 13th. According to cell tower data, his cell phone stops connecting to the network at 2:47 a.m. Consistent, according to the affidavit, with the phone either losing coverage, being switched to airplane mode, or being turned off entirely, investigators would later characterize this gap as a deliberate attempt to avoid leaving a location trail during the window the murders took place. Video shows the Elantra arriving in the immediate area of the King Road house and then leaving the scene at a high rate of speed at approximately 4:20 a.m. Investigators believe, based on this footage combined with cell data and witness accounts, that the murders occurred sometime between 4 a.m. and 4:25 a.m., a window of no more than 25 minutes for 4 lives to be taken. Cell phone data investigators later cross-reference against this footage shows Kohberger's phone using cellular resources near his Pullman apartment before tracking a path south following the same general route the Elantra is seen taking on. Surveillance video. At 2:47 a.m., the phone stops reporting to the network entirely, a gap investigators interpret as either the device losing signal being switched into airplane mode or being powered off outright for the duration of the attack before reconnecting sometime afterward. What happens inside the King Road house during that narrow window is reconstructed by investigators through the physical evidence at the scene, autopsy findings, and the account of a surviving roommate. Prosecutors say Kohberger enters through a sliding glass door at the back of the house, making his way first to the 3rd floor. Kaylee Goncalves and Maddie Mogen are killed in Maddie's bedroom. Autopsies would later show both were stabbed multiple times, likely while still asleep. A tan leather knife sheath is left behind directly on the bed next to Maddie's body, the single piece of physical evidence that would eventually break the entire case open. Xana Kernodle and Ethan Chapin are killed on the floor below. According to one of the surviving roommates, she was startled awake around 4 a.m. by sounds coming from elsewhere in the house. She has described standing in what she called frozen shock, as she watched a masked man dressed head to toe in black walk past her toward an exterior door before leaving the residence. The weapon used in the attacks is described in court filings as a large fixed-blade knife, consistent with a military-style crowbar knife, a weapon that to this day has never been recovered by investigators despite the extensive search of Kohberger's vehicle residence and known movements in the weeks following the murders. 2 additional roommates in the house survived the night entirely unharmed, having been asleep on a different floor during the attack. The full scope of what had happened inside that house is not discovered until later that same day when a 911 call brings police to the scene. When officers arrive at the King Road house, the scene they walk into is one investigators would later describe as among the most disturbing any of them had encountered in their careers. Idaho State Police forensic teams work alongside Moscow police to process the residents room by room, while the surviving roommates who had spent the morning in shock, unable to fully process what had happened just floors away from where they slept, are. moved to safety and begin providing the accounts that would become central to the case moving forward. For nearly 6 weeks after November 13th, 2022, the person responsible for these 4 murders is a complete unknown. Moscow, Idaho, a small college town of roughly 25,000 people, has no recent history of anything resembling this level of violence. And the absence of an obvious suspect leaves both the university and the wider community in a state of prolonged fear. Classes are affected. Students leave campus early for winter break rather than stay in a town where a quadruple murderer is still walking free. Local and national media descend on Moscow in the days following the murders, turning what had been a quiet farming and university community into the center of one of the most closely watched criminal investigations in the country. Investigators publicly ask residents to be on the lookout for a white Hyundai Elantra, seen repeatedly on surveillance footage near the King Road house, one of the only public leads released during those first weeks. Beyond that vehicle description, law enforcement offers the community very little in the way of details, creating a prolonged period where speculation, fear, and uncertainty dominate a town that had never experienced anything like this before. University of Idaho administrators face their own difficult decisions during this stretch, offering students the option to finish the semester remotely given the ongoing danger and uncertainty. Many take that option, leaving parts of campus visibly emptier than normal for the final weeks of the fall term. A small but telling sign of just how deeply the murders had disrupted ordinary life in Moscow, even for students who had no direct connection to the King Road house at all. The break in the case does not come from a witness or a tip. It comes from a discarded knife sheath processed patiently in a lab while investigators work quietly in the background pursuing DNA, and technical leads the public knows almost nothing about until an arrest is finally made. Throughout those 6 weeks, true crime communities online and national news outlets alike fill the information gap with speculation of their own, ranging from theories about a personal connection between one of the victims and the killer to broader questions about whether Moscow police were equipped to handle an investigation of this scale at all. Very little of that public speculation would end up matching the actual mechanism that finally cracked the case. A quiet, methodical process of DNA analysis and vehicle tracking playing out almost entirely outside of public view. The knife sheath found beside Maddie Mogen's body contains touch DNA on its button snap, a small enough biological sample that processing and comparing it takes investigators weeks. In parallel, detectives use surveillance footage from the King Road neighborhood to slowly narrow down the white sedan repeatedly seen near the house, eventually identifying it specifically as a 2015 Hyundai Elantra. On November 29th, a Washington State University police officer locates a white 2015 Elantra registered to Bryan Kohberger parked on campus. Investigators discover Kohberger had switched the vehicle's registration from Pennsylvania to Washington on November 18th, just 5 days after the murders, receiving a new license plate in the process. Cell phone records investigators had already been analyzing are cross-referenced against this new vehicle, information confirming a consistent travel pattern matching the Elantra's movements on the night of the murders. FBI agents begin tracking Kohberger directly as he prepares to leave Washington for his parents' home in Pennsylvania for the holidays. Investigators also worked backward through Kohberger's own history during this stretch of the investigation, using an earlier traffic stop in August where he had provided a cell phone number to a deputy as a foundational data point for building out the surveillance timeline connecting his phone to the King Road area over the preceding months. That single routine traffic stop months before the murders would end up becoming one of the quiet threads investigators pulled to help stitch together a case that at the time still had no publicly named suspect at all. In mid-December, Kohberger drives roughly 2,500 miles across the country to Pennsylvania, accompanied by his father in the same white Elantra, the same vehicle investigators had already connected to the crime scene. During that drive, he is pulled over twice on the same day in Indiana for tailgating, though neither stop leads to any indication he is a wanted suspect. On December 27th, Pennsylvania police recovered discarded trash from the Kohberger family home in Monroe County. DNA extracted from that trash is sent to the Idaho State Lab, for comparison against the touch DNA recovered from the knife sheath button snap. The results show a near-certain familial match. Investigators determined the DNA from the trash almost certainly belongs to the father of the person whose DNA was on the sheath. Combined with the vehicle and cell phone evidence, it is enough. On December 30th, 2022, Bryan Kohberger is arrested at his parents' home in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania. Kohberger's arrest brings an abrupt end to a cross-country surveillance operation. FBI agents had been quietly running for days as he made the 2,500-mile drive from Washington to Pennsylvania with his father. Investigators had been tracking his movements the entire time, waiting until they had enough forensic confirmation before moving in. When police and Idaho State Police investigators eventually interview him for the first time following his arrest, he tells one of the officers he looked familiar to him and asks about his parents and his dog as the arrest operation unfolds around the family home. A conversation that stays largely in small talk before shutting down entirely once the interview turns toward the murders themselves. The detail that unsettles investigators and the public most once Kohberger's identity becomes public is not a hidden criminal history. Latah County prosecutor Bill Thompson would later confirm there was no evidence Kohberger had any documented background of violence before the murders. The twist here is different. It is who he was studying to become. Kohberger was a PhD student in criminology, specifically the kind of academic discipline built around understanding how crimes are committed, how evidence is left behind, and how investigators build a case. The same knowledge that might have been used to study crime from an academic distance appears instead in the specific behaviors investigators documented. Surveillance passes near the house in the weeks prior, a masked and gloved appearance during the attack, and a car registration switched just days after the murders. And yet, it was an ordinary piece of overlooked forensic evidence, touch DNA, on a knife sheath button snap, that ultimately undid all of it. The murder weapon itself, a large fixed-blade knife, consistent with a military-style kabar, has never been recovered, despite the extensive search of Kohberger's vehicle, apartment, and family property. That gap remains one of the case's few unresolved physical details even after a full guilty plea and sentencing, a single piece of the puzzle that will likely never be found now that the case has formally closed. President Trump himself publicly weighed in ahead of sentencing, urging the judge to press Kohberger for an explanation, calling the absence of any stated motive deeply unsatisfying for a case that had captured the entire country's attention for over 2 years. Kohberger is indicted by a Latah County grand jury in May 2023 on 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of felony burglary. The case moves slowly through pretrial proceedings for over 2 years as prosecutors weigh pursuing the death penalty. On June 30th, 2025, Kohberger accepts a plea deal. In exchange for avoiding execution, he pleads guilty on July 2nd to all charges and waives his right to appeal. At his sentencing hearing on July 23, 2025, Judge Stephen Hippler hands down 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, along with an additional 10 years for burglary and financial penalties payable to the victims' families. Kohberger declines to speak or offer any explanation. Judge Hippler tells the courtroom that, while the world may now be certain of who committed these acts, the public may never know why. Family members deliver victim impact statements directly to Kohberger, who maintains eye contact but shows no visible reaction throughout. Kaylee's father, Steve Goncalves, tells him plainly that the families had taken this disaster and kept the focus exactly where it belonged, on Kaylee, Maddie, Xana, and Ethan. Maddie's stepfather remembers her as someone who always brought joy, calling her loss a sudden act of evil that took her senselessly and brutally. 4 families continue carrying a loss that a life sentence cannot undo and a motive that a guilty plea never had to explain. What remains is simply this: 4 young people with an entire future ahead of them killed inside their own home by someone none of them had ever knowingly met, and a case closed on paper long before it will ever truly be closed for the people who loved them. Kaylee Goncalves' older sister, Aliva, addressed Kohberger directly at sentencing as well, continuing the family's approach of keeping public attention squarely on the four victims, rather than on the man responsible. The Goncalves family had been publicly vocal in their opposition to the plea deal in the months leading up to sentencing, arguing that a trial and the possibility of the death penalty would have better served justice for their daughter. In a statement issued after the plea was accepted, the family wrote simply that Kaylee, Maddie, Xana, and Ethan have always mattered so much, reminding the public that their light and their entire being remained so visible regardless of how the legal proceedings concluded.